For centuries, the church bells of Westerham have called parishioners to worship, and with their full peal of 8 bells have heralded great occasions, from the proclamation of a new king or queen to the celebration of an English victory. Nowadays, though rung for more modest reasons, they continue to blazon a message to the people of Westerham and represent the voice of the community. It is a community which has made its mark through the years, and many of Westerham's former residents have found a place in our history books. Some have had monuments made to them. Others are remembered in the names of buildings and streets. If a former inhabitant could be transported from the 19th or even the 18th century and stood in the centre of the town, there is much that person would recognise. It would certainly be noisier and busier, but Westerham, along with many of its fine buildings, has stood the test of time. There are people living in Westerham even today to whom some of these old pictures, portraying a more tranquil lifestyle, will be familiar. It is only a moment in time since the fastest mode of transport was the horse, and then amidst much contention, the railway arrived, followed by the internal combustion engine, the modern motor car, juggernauts, and the M25 motorway. But let us leave the pace of modern development behind and go back to the origins of the town, a journey over 1,000 years of recorded history. A small stream rises in the hills at the end of a valley, one of 5 which combine in Westerham to form the River Darrant. No one can be certain why man should have settled here, but the presence of a small river, fertile land, perhaps a clearance in the densely wooded hills and valleys of the Weald, must have been favourable influences. The area certainly attracted an ancient group of settlers called the Cantii tribe. Visible evidence of their occupation is here in Squares Park, a tree-covered earthwork, some 3,000 years old, complete with ramparts. But it was the Jutes who were the real founders of the village, one of the fierce marauding tribes from Scandinavia and northern Germany which invaded eastern Britain in the 5th century. It was a violent and turbulent time, but over the following centuries a more peaceful way of life was established, until rudely interrupted by the invasion of William the Conqueror. Once proclaimed king, William rewarded his supporters with grants of land, and Westerham was handed to Earl Eustace of Boulogne, reputedly one of the knights responsible for King Harold's death at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, as depicted here in the Bayeux tapestry. King William, eager to know every detail of the wealth and property of the land he now ruled, ordered the compilation of the Domesday Survey, and it is in this vast document, dated 1085, we find the first reference to Westerham, or Ouistreham as it was then called. Unravel the terse Latin shorthand, and a picture emerges of a very small village indeed, with a recorded population of only 59 people, living almost entirely off the land. Christianity had long been established in Britain, and most villages had a small Anglo-Saxon church. But the earliest record of a church in Westerham appears not in Domesday, but in a document dated 1122 called the Textus Refensis. This was a register of churches, compiled by the Bishop of Rochester, that paid an annual fee, usually 9 pence, to the mother church in Rochester. Careful examination of the Latin text reveals some familiar names. The church at Otford, 9 pence. Shoreham, 9 pence. And further up the page, Sundridge, Braested, and just visible at the top of the page, the church at Westerham. Time marched on, and ownership of Westerham Manor continued to exchange hands. In 1154, Henry II granted the manor to Hugh de Canville, and it was his family who, some 73 years later, obtained a grant from Henry III to hold a market every Wednesday, a market which was to continue for over 700 years. The de Canvilles had to pay their dues to the king, and perhaps they were finding this a financial strain, because in the mid-13th century Robert de Canville divided Westerham into sub-manors of Edenbridge, Broxham, Vallance and Squerries. This last sub-manor was granted to John de Squerry, who took his name from the estate, possibly from the abundance of squirrels in the surrounding woods. Although some 300 years old, the present house is certainly not the original Squerries Manor. It replaced a much earlier building, thought to have once been the original Westerham Manor. Of the estate and house, John Evelyn, the diarist, wrote in 1658, "A pretty, finely wooded, well-watered estate. The stables good, the house old, but convenient." Unfortunately, there are no records or paintings of the old manor house, and one can only guess what it must have looked like. In contrast, the present 17th century house is well documented. A house of symmetry and elegance, and without doubt the jewel in Westerham's crown. An attribute due almost entirely to the arrival of the Ward family.
Well, they came here in 1731, we think, and in fact you can see the picture behind me of the family, and that was painted by Wootton in 1735. So we've been here a relatively long time. And of course they've collected all the pictures and furniture over the years, which of course gives the house its character and charm. It was built first by Sir Nicholas Crisp in 1687, I think it was finished, so it's over 300 years old. The first Earl of Jersey bought it in 1700 and added the pavilions, which you can see on the picture, which ran down towards the lake, and that nearly doubled the size of the house. Those were later demolished by my ancestors, and they then put wings on either side, and in 1947 those wings were pulled down and the house really went in full circle round to its original shape and size.
Its exterior splendour and setting are matched by an equally attractive interior, enhanced by a collection of fine paintings brought together by Sir Patience Ward, Lord Mayor of London in 1720. After the subdivision of Westerham Manor, Squerries and the other sub-manors had become largely autonomous, and the now much smaller Westerham Manor, still in the hands of the de Canvilles, was run from a newly built property called Court Lodge. Its outside appearance may be deceptive, but Court Lodge is one of Westerham's oldest buildings. Manor courts were held here in the presence of the lord of the manor, or in his absence the bailiff and a jury. Every detail was recorded in the manor rolls, from the hearing of complaints to the punishment of crime. The earliest records, undecipherable to the untrained eye, were all written in Latin. English would have been used from the mid-16th century, but we have to wait for the 18th and 19th centuries for the style of writing to become more familiar. Here, inside Court Lodge, Westerham, the original courtroom. Harsh punishment was meted out here, even for the pettiest of crimes. Strange ghosts haunt this house, for it is said that here, on the south side of the building, people were hanged. Lesser criminals suffered the indignity of the pillory or the stocks on the green. In 1627, John Gates insulted the parish clerk, spent 2 hours in the stocks, and was fined 3 shillings and 4pence. In 1712, John Denham fined for selling ale in time of divine service. In 1590, John Weeks fined for pitching the sweepings of his house into the street. John Homewood fined for keeping cows and pigs in the highway to the detriment of the hedges. People were even fined for neglecting the coming to church. Times were hard indeed, poverty a part of life, and so too a dislike of the ruling classes. In 1381, we hear of the men of Westerham taking a vigorous part in Wat Tyler's rebellion over the imposition of unpopular taxes, a rebellion in which Tyler came to a sticky end in Smithfield in front of the young Richard II. 79 years later, in 1450, the men of Kent, led by Jack Cade, fought their way to the very heart of the ruling classes. They marched on Sevenoaks and then into London, killed Sir Humphrey Stafford, leader of the King's men, executed Sir William Cromer, the owner of Squerries, and killed his father-in-law, Lord Say and Seal of Knowle House in Sevenoaks. By the 16th century, Westerham was beginning to take on a more familiar shape, with the houses around the green and stretching east and west along the river. Henry VIII must have been a regular visitor to the area, as he would have ridden this way to see Anne Boleyn at Hever. It is said that the sound of his horn at Horn's Hill was relayed across the valley to warn Anne of Henry's approach. Certain it is that at the time of the Reformation, Henry acquired the manors of Westerham and Squerries, long-time properties of the abbots of Westminster. Both were granted to his loyal servants, but notably he gave Westerham Manor, with the church, to Sir John Gresham of Titsey. The church, already enlarged with north and south aisles, stood at the highest point at the end of the green, looking much as it does today. Inside, the hushed atmosphere evokes a sense of timelessness. This church has served the people of Westerham for over 800 years. Much more than a building, it was and is the heart of the community. They're all here, the people who lived in Westerham through the centuries, and are now immortalised in stone and in brass. Some 450 years old, these remarkable brasses of prominent Westerham people provide a fascinating picture of the fashions of the Tudor period. This is John Stacey, with his wives Margaret and Joan. He died in 1533, during the reign of Henry VIII. Notice his long, fur-trimmed gown, a garment which remained fashionable for many years. His wives are dressed almost exactly alike, both wearing an early Tudor kennel headdress and veil. William Middleton, seen here with his wives Elizabeth and Dorothy, died in 1557, again wearing a long fur-trimmed gown. His wives are almost identically dressed, but this time their dresses are more intricate, and the French hood has superseded the kennel headdress. This set of bronzes from 1566 features the Westerham family of William Stace. With him, his two wives, Joan and Alice, both in similar costume and rather unusual headdress. Joan, his first wife, had 3 children, while Alice had 12. 2 of the 7 daughters, grouped on the right, are wearing headdresses. The rest have long flowing hair, which indicates that they either died in childhood or died unmarried. The church played a major part in all their lives, and every Sunday local people would have filled the pews to capacity. Their children would have been baptized in this medieval font, which is as old as the church itself, and since 1559 their names would have been recorded in the church records. Names that were once prominent and now forgotten. Names that have passed into obscurity, but some of great renown that will never be forgotten. James Wolfe was destined to change the course of history. Born on the 2nd of January 1727 at the Old Vicarage in Westerham, he entered into military life at the very young age of 14. By the early age of 32 he had become a general, and was, against overwhelming odds at the Battle of Quebec, to effectively secure the greater part of the American continent for the British Crown. During his childhood days, he lived with his parents and brother at Spiers, now Quebec House, and during this time built up a great friendship with the young George Ward, who lived at Squerries Court, seen here in John Wotton's painting of the Ward family at Squerries in 1735.
Well, the Wolfes were living in Westerham at what was then called Spiers, is now Quebec House. Mrs. Wolfe was a Yorkshire lady, and the Wards were basically a Yorkshire family, so I think they obviously had quite a lot in common immediately from that point of view. And I think they remain family friends. And James Wolfe and the youngest Ward boy were friends throughout their lives.
In fact, it's through the Ward family that the memory of Wolfe has been preserved in Westerham. He was a great playmate of George Ward's. There obviously weren't enough grounds here to play soldiers in, so I think he used to always go and play soldiers with George Ward. And indeed, when he left when the family left, when James was only 11, to go and live in Greenwich, which became more properly the family home. He used to come back and visit George Ward, and it was at Squares at the age of 14 that he received his first commission.
Wolfe's death in the midst of victory at the Battle of Quebec was one of those great milestones in British history. It captured the imagination of many artists, although many paintings were based on an original by Benjamin West.
This is one of the many copies of Benjamin West's famous picture about the death of Wolfe. Very inaccurate, because a lot of the people that you see in the picture weren't there at the time. For instance, Monckton here was out in the field getting wounded, not standing looking over Wolfe. Surgeon Adair, that this is meant to be there. Wolfe's surgeon, he was back in England at the time, we suspect. And the real scene of the death of Wolfe would probably have been just 2 or 3 people standing beside him. It shows fairly graphically the wounds of Wolfe. The first one, which hit him in the wrist, and he quickly bound it up, and you can see the blood dripping from it. And the third shot, from which he finally died, was the one in the chest here, and that shows 2 nice little droplets of blood coming all the way down onto the ground. But in those days, I think it was indelicate, shall we say, to show where the second shot hit him, which was probably the one which caused him the most pain. It's not known entirely what Wolfe's appearance was. The trouble was that he spent all his early life campaigning, so he never had his portrait painted as a grown man. And most of the pictures that you see of him, the portraits that you see, which are painted posthumously, are taken from a little pencil drawing drawn by Harvey Smith, one of his aides-de-camps. A bit of a character, really, showing his very pronounced pointed nose, his sloping forehead and his receding chin. I think a lot of artists didn't particularly like to portray him too much like that sketch, because it isn't, or it doesn't suggest, a strong man. It's a rather weak-looking face, if you like. And so a lot of artists tried to improve on the little caricature. And if one bears in mind that it was slightly a caricature, perhaps he was somewhat better looking than the cartoon suggests.
Appearances aside, James Wolfe's short life was one of great achievement, linked forever to Westerham by his famous statue, unveiled on the green by Earl Roberts on the 2nd of January 1911, and Quebec House, which remains a shrine to his memory. Formerly bought by Colonel Charles Ward of Squares Court in 1900, the largely 16th century house was given to the National Trust in 1918 by Canadian Joseph Bowles-Lemont. Quebec House owes its present state of excellent repair, in large measure, to a severe flood which occurred in 1968. Damage from the flood was considerable, but insignificant in comparison to that which had been caused over the years by Death Watch beetle. The house was gutted and virtually rebuilt. Now restored to its former glory, it retains much of the atmosphere that prevailed when it was occupied by the Wolfe family. For the 150 years after the time of Wolfe, life in Westerham would have continued, largely unchanged. But what did the people of Westerham do? How did they earn a living? Once again, the church records provide the answers, at least from the beginning of the 19th century, when records of baptisms included the trade or profession of the child's father. There were bricklayers, shoemakers, leather cutters, omnibus drivers, coach builders, farmers, hairdressers, clerks and gardeners, and so the list goes on, with the occasional gentleman to relieve the list of the working-class occupations. But the most common job to be found was labourer, pages of them, which gives us an idea of the standard of living of the majority of Westerham's population in the 19th century. Undoubtedly most labourers would have worked on the land, but a few could have found work below ground digging out ragstone from what are now called the Westerham mines. Now looked after by the Kent Trust for Nature Conservation, the mines provide an ideal environment for bats which hibernate here during the winter. Inside, a network of interconnecting tunnels and passages, some 6 or 7 feet high, others blocked off or restricted to crawling space only. Extending up to a quarter of a mile into the greensand, they are a relic of a bygone industry. Listen carefully and you can almost hear the distant sound of men working the rock with their hammers and chisels. Kentish ragstone has been used in the construction of many of Westerham's buildings, some most probably from the local mines. But of course the town is much older than the mines. Indeed, it is centuries old, with many old and venerable buildings displaying a real mixture of stone and decorative brickwork. Lovely old roofs, dormer windows, brickwork, pillars, bays, gables and chimneys can all be found in Westerham. By the 18th century, major developments were taking place. Turnpike roads were built from Sevenoaks and from Bromley. The population was increasing and communications improving. One sees the stagecoach surging off from the George and Dragon for Croydon or London, no doubt bearing with it a concealed gun or two, for highwaymen were numerous and venturesome. But their days were numbered. The age of steam had arrived. By the mid-19th century, lines had linked London with the south coast. But Westerham had to wait. While other towns were prospering from the new railway, 19th century Westerham remained old-fashioned, a quiet backwater with only the sound of the occasional horse-drawn vehicle to disturb these quiet street scenes. How pleasant it must have been to wander through this quaint old town without the noise, pollution and danger of incessant traffic.
I remember going down to the forge and buying a hoop there. I think it cost me 6pence. And the girls used to have wooden hoops and the boys used to have metal hoops, and we used to have what they call a skid, and we would run for miles, of course. We had all simple toys, and we used to make a lot of things ourselves which the kiddies wouldn't think of these days. Long Pond is amazing because you wouldn't know it was a pond now. There used to be the long pond and the round pond. Now the long pond used to be nearly opposite a pitch cottage. We used to have our own brewery then, which was Bushell, Watkins and Smith. They used to brew their own beer, and you could certainly smell it when they got the hops out of the kiln, of course. And Long Pond used to be opposite that, and it really was a long pond. And of course, when you got the very bad winters, it was a well-known skating place was a Long Pond. I can remember sliding on it as a boy, these very long slides and people skating on it where it was really thick, you know. And also the story of my father said he used to fish there at one time before they started tarring the roads. And when they started tarring the roads, the tar used to go into the Long Pond, and he said that gradually killed the fish off, pollution.
Changes were taking place that would eventually draw Westerham into the modern day. To the west, the town was dominated by the tall chimney of the brewery, which no doubt served Westerham's centuries-old pubs and hotels. New shops were opening to meet a growing demand for goods, sporting familiar names such as Dove's, the butchers, Bird, the ironmongers, Hughes, Evendon's, Fuller's, Atkinson and Sutton.
And of course we had the local gasworks, which was up the Croydon Road, you see, and It was nothing for us to be given sixpence and with the old truck go and get sixpenn'orth of coke, which was to last out. I can remember the gas lighting coming. Before that we had oil lamps.
New services were needed to supply the needs of a growing population. A laundry providing much needed jobs for local women. A post office, telephone exchange and fire brigade, all adding to the more traditional activities of the miller and blacksmith. Meanwhile, plans for a railway connection had come to fruition, thanks to the efforts of William Tipping, Squire of Braisted Place, and Richard Dirtnell, the Braisted builder. Like any new major development, the prospective railway was not welcomed by everyone in Westerham. But, despite local opposition, construction of the 4 3/4 mile branch line from Dunton Green to Westerham went ahead and was finally opened on the 7th of July 1881. Scepticism soon turned into excitement as it provided a new and ready access to the pleasures of London. It opened up Westerham to new markets for timber, coal, beer, cattle and horticultural products, and led to the birth of the commuter. Soon the Westerham flyer became a common sight, steaming its way to the villages of Braisted, Chevening and Dunton Green. There must be many people who can cast their minds back to those magnificent years of steam, and can remember the old route and the miniature railway stations, such as this one at Braisted. Braisted Station may have been relegated to the history books, but Braisted Village continues to be a thriving community. It is a village which vies with Westerham in antiquity, a small place indeed when compared with Westerham, but clearly identified in the Domesday Book, with a church, 2 mills and woodland, and coming under the property of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Indeed, a medieval archbishop is pictured in the village sign, standing in the garden of Braisted. In the background, the North Downs, and just below, the Pilgrim's Way, leading to the distant spires of Canterbury. To the left of the Archbishop, the River Darrant and Braisted Village Church, a church which only very recently was severely damaged by fire. Ironically, the most suitable firm specializing in the restoration of period buildings was only yards away. Established in 1591, Dirtnell's has passed almost continuously from father to son, and is the nation's oldest building firm. Not only is Dirtnell's name synonymous with the magnificent reconstruction of Braisted Church, but also the construction of many of the older houses in Braisted. This is number 17, the High Street. It's Braisted's oldest house, having stood here since 1430, when even America was undiscovered. The passage beside this and other adjacent houses once served as a right-of-way to the river at the rear of the house, and along which cattle passed to water, or villagers to draw water, a task made easier by ancient steps still set into the river bank. The almost incessant and intrusive roar of 20th century traffic along the A25 has now replaced the peace and tranquillity that was once characteristic of Braisted. The High Street is now profuse with antique dealers, but many of these premises were once occupied by local traders, providing the needs of the community. Many were well-established family businesses, some with their own means of delivery. Family names that were once very familiar. The mixture of shops and houses would have overlooked a wide and often quite empty street. On the green, the old pump still stands, once in company with the stocks and an assortment of carriages and wagons awaiting attention at the local forge. The occasional horse-drawn traffic coming along the turnpike road from Sevenoaks or Westerham. A few pedestrians, local workers, perhaps children playing in the street. This was the scene of yesterday. For Braisted, like Westerham, was a rural community living off the land and from seasonal work, such as acorn and fruit picking, and of course, hop tying and hop picking. Many of Braisted's women and children would help in this work, making what they could while the work lasted. In fact, holidays for Braisted's schoolchildren were arranged around seed and harvest time. These couldn't be allowed to fail simply because the school had opened. Not all was peace and tranquillity in Braisted. Every so often there was cause for celebration. Perhaps it was Braisted's Fair Day, or Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, or the golden wedding celebrations of the local squire, William Tipping, in 1894. Whatever the reason, there were certainly celebrations in Braisted when this very early photo was taken. It's rather faded, but just take a look at these fascinating characters. Everyone from the youngest to the oldest, the poorest to the richest, seemed to be taking part. Perhaps even Mr. William Tipping was there. He took a great interest in the village and was popular with the school children. Surprisingly, he was a well-known Liverpool coal merchant, and throughout Victoria's reign, he and his family lived in Braisted Place, a mansion which itself has a long and interesting history. Emperor of France, Napoleon III, lived here in the mid-19th century, but it was during the ownership of Dr. John Turton in 1784 that Robert Adam was commissioned to design the greater part of the existing house. Robert Adam is also associated with Coombe Bank, an independent Roman Catholic school just outside Braisted. Once a centre of distinguished literary and scientific circle, and great names such as Oscar Wilde and Darwin, it epitomises the best of Palladian architecture, as Juliet Austin, former headmistress of the school, explains.
This building was started in 1720 by the architect Roger Morris, who was one of the architects involved with the beginning of the Palladian movement in England. I think it's probably suffered less than most Palladian houses, so it is a very good example of pure Palladian architecture. The house was built for Colonel John Campbell, who was the younger son of the Duke of Argyll. Later he became Duke of Argyll and kept this as his seat. It was rather small for a stately home, but I think he preferred it to the other family buildings.
Robert Adams' contributions to the house were relatively small, amounting to a north-facing facade and a number of ornamental bridges in the extensive gardens. A room now attributed to Adam was added as part of a later 18th century wing.
We know it was not designed by Adam, but we think perhaps the ceiling might have been inspired by him. It was a larger drawing room than the house originally had. The room that we now use as a chapel, which was in fact turned by the nuns of the Holy Child Order into a chapel, was built by Robert Mond as a music gallery. It has a fantastic ceiling with the most wonderful cameo effect, and in fact the original designs, colour and all, for it are in Sevenoaks Library in our archive. It makes a most attractive chapel. There is also what is now used as a library, which was another drawing room, which was redecorated by the Victorian illustrator Walter Crane for a man called Spottiswoode, who lived here at the time, who was the King's printer and a very distinguished scientist as well. And when he bought some Neapolitan and Flemish paintings to put into the room, he asked Walter Crane to design the room to match the paintings, and a quite remarkable job he made of it.
It was Sir Winston's wish that, if possible, a statue should commemorate him in Westerham. It is a proud moment to see the fulfillment of his wish on this historic occasion. Let us remember this great man whose grim courage and determination led the world through its darkest hours. Beneath the fine statue you will see before you lies a marble plinth presented to the people of Westerham by Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia.
With masonry work complete, Oscar Niemann's bronze statue of Winston Churchill is guided into position on the green in readiness for the unveiling by the Australian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies.
So long will people be aware of Winston Churchill, not only as an echo of the past, but as a living presence in this place.
There was so much more to his life than the politics. And I think if one thing more than anything else amazes people when they survey the panorama of his life, it is just how varied his interests were. I mean, this is a man who at his death had completed 50 volumes of biography and history, which is more than many full-time historians. There were very nearly 500 completed canvases, which is a good output for a lifetime's artist who does nothing else. He built that huge kitchen garden wall, which I can claim to have helped him with in a small way, the better part of 3 cottages, and in between times found the time to defeat Hitler too.
Churchill's home for over 40 years until his death in 1965 was Chartwell. It was an unattractive property when he bought it in 1922, but the story of its transformation to his plans and to a large extent at his own hands is remarkable in itself. Churchill's architect, Philip Tilden, later wrote, "No client that I have had has ever spent more time, trouble or interest in the making of his home." Winston loved Chartwell. Its antiquity pleased his sense of history. Its rural setting, overlooking the Weald of Kent, satisfied his instinctive love of the countryside. Its grounds and gardens stimulated his desire to plant and build. Chartwell's dramatic exterior masks the light, tranquil rooms within, perhaps a reflection on Winston's personality. The drawing room where family and friends gathered before dinner or for cordial conversation. The dining room with its great windows overlooking the slopes of the gardens to the lake beyond, a room dedicated as much to the pleasures of conversation as to the delights of eating and drinking. The study crowded with the things that were cherished by Winston. Used constantly for 40 years, it now appears just as he left it for the last time in October 1964. Here he wrote his great histories, reflected on the power of Hitler, on the fate of the British Empire, and on the future of Europe.
So many people say, you know, presumably your grandfather must have been a very fearsome, formidable person to a small boy, and nothing could be further from the truth. He was so affectionate and loving, and amazingly found so much time for me. I would go up to his bedroom, which is adjacent to his upstairs study, at about 9:30 each morning, and through the wreaths of cigar smoke I would detect the features of the venerable grandpapa with his half-rim glasses perched on the end of his nose, great big cigar in his mouth, always a Scotch whisky, even earlier, but a very weak one, I have to say. His budgerigar Toby in a cage, chippering away, and he'd be dictating to a secretary. As soon as I arrived, he would dismiss the secretary and say, "Now, what shall we do today, Winston?" And always on the agenda would be a visit to the Golden Orf and the dark pools that he'd built among the bamboo groves, and then following the course of the waterfalls down below the swimming pool, we would go and visit the black swans, which was a gift of the government of Australia. And finally we would end up at the pigsties down by the farm. And my grandfather had a great affection for his pigs, and he'd get his walking stick out and he'd scratch their backs, and they would grunt at him and he would grunt back at them. And I remember him saying to me once, "Winston, bear in mind that a cat will look down on man, a dog looks up to man, but a pig will look you in the eye and see as equal."
Some of Winston's happiest hours were spent in the grounds of Chartwell, planting trees, excavating lakes, building walls. But his interest and respect for animals were never far away, as Victor Vincent, head gardener from 1947, recalls.
I got into trouble with him once for killing a grass snake down by the swimming pool. He found out I did it. What happened? And, well, he called me over and he said, you know, that's got just as much right to live as you have. No, I didn't hardly know what to say at the time, but I sort of thought, I said, well, that's all right, sir. I said, but they do frighten the ladies. And he just grunted, and that was that.
Sir Winston never forgot his close links with Westerham and its community, and the town, in turn, remembers him with affection. Today, a lamp still burns in the church to commemorate his 90th birthday. The church itself was frequented by Churchill on a number of family occasions. Here, the christening of his grandson, Nicholas Soames, in 1948. And in 1952, the christening of Jeremy. Few men can ever have done so much or driven themselves so hard as Churchill. A politician, an author, artist, builder, and, as Sir Robert Menzies reflects, a man who led Britain in its time of need.
But in the greatest hours of our race, Winston Churchill made history. And he made it not by quiet, leisurely reflection in the study, but by producing from his enormous genius a capacity for taking decisions in the crisis, in this country, in the target area, with speed and command and fire.
So now there are two statues on the green, the seated figure of Sir Winston Churchill and the triumphant James Wolfe, two men of international fame who had such a major influence on the course of British history. Westerham is proud of them, and indeed the many other less famous people who have, over the years, influenced and moulded the character and life of the town. The very character and life which, in recent years, has been threatened by the pace of modern development, the thundering intrusion of modern-day vehicles. But Westerham has survived, now a busy, thriving community, and, in spite of the motor car, still with much of its former rural atmosphere, still with the sound of church bells which faithfully and constantly through the ages have rung out their message to the town.